Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in the 35th edition of our CVC Insider Series. My name is Omara. I'm part of 500 Global, one of the world's most active seed stage investment firms, having backed over 2,500 exceptional startups in 75 different countries. At 500, we work closely with corporate investors and innovators. And about a year and a half ago, we launched the CVC Insider Series to continue raising the bar of the corporate venture community. Every 2 weeks, we host this roundtable featuring a top corporate venturing practitioner or expert in the matter and sharing their unique journey into the industry and best practices they developed throughout their careers. This week, we have the pleasure to feature Brian Schettler, partner from AEI HorizonX. Our fabulous host, Nicolas Sauvage, will be moderating today's discussion, but there is also a Q&A function, so please feel free to ask questions along the way, and we'll do our best to cover them. We hope you enjoyed today's session and come back for the next one as well. Nicolas, over to you.
Thank you, Mera, and thank you, 500 Global. It's a really good initiative for anyone thinking about joining corporate venturing space or already in it and wanting to learn from practitioners, the best practices. Brian, my first time with him was actually in a roundtable arranged by the GCV Institute, and I was so impressed with all the things he was sharing so candidly. I felt like, okay, he has to be in our show. So Brian, if you don't mind maybe sharing 5 to 10 minutes your journey into corporate venturing, which, like you said earlier, it was not the obvious path. So please do share, and then I will double click on what you share with us.
Well, thanks, Nicolas, and thanks for the invite. It's great to be here. And as many that have met me in the past know, whether from GCV or others, and this is my passion to kind of share knowledge, experience that we've learned. That, like Nicolas said, the path wasn't necessarily obvious for us 5 years ago when we launched HorizonX inside of Boeing. A lot of lessons learned along the way, and where we can, and we benefited a lot from the experience of others to navigate some of those paths. And so we can pay it forward and share more knowledge and experience with others so they can be successful in their journey in this world. It's hopefully just a little bit we can do. That said, so for me personally, my path into venture in the first place, pretty unorthodox, as I think many that get into corporate venture maybe agree with. But I was an electrical engineer. I got started in aerospace and defense right out of college and was quickly enamored with kind of the technical side of aerospace, but growing into more strategy, corporate development, and transaction-oriented worlds that was really blending internal innovation with outside innovation and how we could bring that together. And a lot of M&A deals, a lot of corporate partnerships. And it was really before sort of corporate venture in aerospace was kind of a thing. I navigated a couple other aerospace companies across my career, and then had the privilege of about 5 years ago now, joining Boeing and launching a corporate venture capital fund from scratch. They were creating a new centralized innovation arm. They wanted to tap into the outside world, but they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know how corporate venture could help. They knew that it should, but how it would work inside of Boeing explicitly was to be determined. So I literally showed up at Boeing with a blank piece of paper and the task to design a corporate venture capital unit that would work, not only for aerospace in general. Yes, aerospace, Airbus had done it. And so there was a little bit of history there, but getting things to work with your own corporate culture is the devil in the details. And so really trying to build something there was the task at hand. So over the next 5 years, we really had the chance to integrate sort of an outside external innovation program with Boeing technical experts. As many big companies can attest to, when you have an engineering strong organization like a Boeing, there's a lot of resistance and roadblocks to getting outside innovation programs up and running. So the early days were fraught with cultural dynamics, antibody rejection inside of Boeing, we called it, and really trying to get buy-in to the program so that we could create value. right? We are, as a true CVC, wanting to do more than just the investment. The investment is the means to get access to the capability and to support and grow startups around the world. But at the end of the day, if you aren't translating that into value creation inside your corporate parent, it's really no different than just being, an investor off of your pension fund or the like. So we really spent a lot of time of trying to get the operational components of the program right and how that gets adopted. So over those 5 years or so inside of Boeing, it was a great time. We executed about 40 direct investments in startups around the world. We deployed roughly, a couple $100 million in capital across those investments. We like to target early stage companies so we can really ensure we're at the key decision gates to make the tech successful for aerospace, given the unique barriers to entry, regulatory dimensions, and the like that comes with aerospace. We've had some exits. We've had some, great outcomes in terms of value creation inside of Boeing, and things were going well. Now, if you read the news, which I know everyone does, Boeing faced some corporate challenges in the last couple of years as it related to the overall health of the company, right? The corporate balance sheet was stretched with COVID, with the MAX. There was new priorities inside the company of where to deploy the cash generation that it had, and ventures was starting to be vulnerable to those decisions happening at the corporate level of where cash would be deployed. So I embarked on an initiative to try to create a solution that didn't involve just walking away, shutting it down, saying goodbye. We can't fund it now. Thanks for the last 4 years, but we have to take a pause. That wasn't going to be good for our portfolio. It wasn't going to be good for aerospace innovation, and it certainly wasn't going to be good for Boeing. And so what we came up with is this hybrid venture fund structure with Boeing that we announced in August of this year. And that's a spin out of the fund and a strategic partnership with Boeing in conjunction with AE Industrial Partners, which is an existing private equity firm focused on aerospace, to create and evolve the HorizonX platform to get sources of funding from not just Boeing, but other third-party capital providers. And so that new structure is what we have in place. I like to call it the best of both worlds, right? We still have a direct strategic linkage to Boeing to get the bi-directional transfer of capability from Boeing, subject matter experts, regulatory specialists, market channel access, but and then we flow capability back to Boeing in the form of disruptive startups that can really make an impact on aerospace. And we're able to do everything that we did inside of Boeing, but now it's not just the Boeing balance sheet that's on the hook. So we're raising funds from new limited partners. We have a process now that can operate with additional speed and agility, despite what we were able to do in Boeing, which was very fast. We had quick decision-making. Being on the outside, being more, in a dedicated fund structure can be even quicker, right? We can less bureaucracy and more focus on speed. And it's been a fantastic outcome so far. So we're about 3 months into this endeavor. We've already invested sizable amounts of follow-on capital in our current portfolio and have started new investments in new companies. And so I'm really excited to talk about that more and other topics, Nicolas, of just how this could, really support other corporates that might be facing similar situations where they're getting the benefits from venture capital, but really are looking for ways to, solve capital challenges, bring other participants to the table, without kind of sacrificing that startup access.
Very nice. Thank you, Brian. I think I can speak for everyone listening in. We want to learn more about the hybrid model and the best of both worlds. But let's go back a little bit on the start of your career. You joined a very strong engineering company. How much of your background in terms of education helped you or was challenging?
Yeah, I think there was 2 or 3 components to my background that really got in the sweet spot of why Boeing wanted me to build the HorizonX Ventures platform. One is just past aerospace and defense experience, right? This is such a niche sort of industry. There's so many nuances of aerospace versus, automotive or even other just heavily regulated industries that having a career sort of focused on that world really helps you kind of understand and bridge connections to technology and products and services and ultimate capabilities that big companies like Boeing would be looking for. Secondly, the technical background. I'm certainly not advocating that every venture capital funds manager is a past engineer, but like you said, in an engineering dominated sort of company like Boeing, it certainly didn't hurt that I had an engineering background. It could talk the talk with the engineering teams, or at least bring some street credibility, if nothing else. Now, I'm not a practicing engineer for 20 plus years now, so it's not like I'm living and breathing the details like they do, but it does give you a framework to think like an engineer would inside the company and try to reach, a common language of how we can embrace capability from the outside without being disruptive or threatening to the world they operate inside of Boeing. And then lastly, I had an MBA. I spent a lot of time in corporate strategy roles, business development kind of roles. And that's, so much of what you have to do inside these companies to really critically assess the startups, really bring that sort of experience and support to them to ensure they navigate, their own company dynamics in a strong way, right? It's not just, is the technology successful at the end of the day? These have to be sustaining businesses that are investable and enduring to ensure that they're meeting Boeing's needs and other companies' needs in the long run. The famous expression, right? There's nothing strategic about a company that goes bankrupt, right? So
nothing strategic.
Yeah.
No learnings, nothing.
Right. So bringing all of that together, I think was just, at least in the Boeing case, a good combination.
Very nice. And so you mentioned also your background in corporate partnerships and M&A. What is the learning from that experience you brought into building the CVC? And what was the unlearning you had to do to build the CVC?
It's a perfect question, Nicholas, because when you're in traditional corporate development roles or M&A transaction roles, usually, and this isn't to be insulting or confrontational in any way, but there's a limited set of options of what you have at your disposal. There's playbooks to do an acquisition. There's playbooks to do a divestiture. There's, investment banks that support you with the transaction, mechanics. It's a very almost scripted sort of playbook. And so when you approach a ventures role, I would argue in some of these other corporate partnerships roles, I was trying to expand the universe of what the options were. It's no longer binary of you can do it this way or that way, and what are the options in the middle that might involve creativity, that require maybe understanding unique circumstances. Maybe it's not 100% equity ownership, or maybe it's not, a 50-50 JV. Like there's something else. And so I think that experience was really kind of the open mind that I wanted to bring to venture and how it worked inside of Boeing. We could design equity investments in ways that gave us, larger sort of 20% kind of ownership, and we could take a board position and be active on governance. Or, we could take a smaller sort of ownership, but you know what, that was enough of a threshold for the corporate to want to engage in a commercial agreement with us, or that was enough to maybe negotiate, some sort of most favored nation pricing or something like that would be valuable to the enterprise. And so it was from that transaction perspective that that passed in corporate partnerships, and truly like understanding the win-win scenarios here, right? This can't be viewed as I win as the corporate and you lose as the startup, or I win as the Boeing investor, but you lose as the TDK investor, right? That is not a good outcome, right? This only works when you have aligned interests, the investors win, the startup and the founders win, and the corporate parent wins. And so I think that's what was exciting by this. Now you ask what I had to unlearn,
Yep.
You had to unlearn a lot of those traditional sort of approaches, right? You constantly want to go back to your fact base of, gosh, how did I diligence that, company in the past. Well, that company was a $1 billion publicly traded company. I'm investing in a pre-revenue, 5-person company here, right? You can't apply the same sort of process, the same level of scrutiny and diligence that you might have been sort of trained in the past, like how you assess risk, right? You have to unlearn some of the risk tolerance, issues that might come from big corporate gigs in the past.
Very nice. One thing you also mentioned is you joined to start this corporate VC in Boeing, and Airbus already had one. The fact that Airbus already had one, was it a blessing or a curse?
It was definitely a blessing. As you can imagine, with big companies like Boeing that have near peer competitors, you're always scanning what the other player is doing in the market, and it's not necessarily a copycat strategy, but it's more like, hey, they did that. Let's assess our way to do it. Not 100% similar. In fact, we did it very, very differently than Airbus Ventures. Airbus Ventures set up their own, dedicated fund from the beginning. It wasn't off Airbus's balance sheet. It was funded as a dedicated structure. Boeing started it differently. We started 100% inside of Boeing, much more strategic focus. So it was really more just the validation that, look, a venture capital model works in aerospace, or at least others are trying it. We should experiment with it too, just in our own unique way.
And how did you sell the unique ways? It's easy to say that's what they've done, we should do the same. But when you start to deviate, that's where you need to go back to a why. Why do you deviate? Why do you do a certain way?
Yeah.
How did you articulate that?
Well, first it was stepping back of like really assessing what we want to get out of this, right? And for Boeing's point of view, it was much more about technology access. I know it's overused, but like, how do you disrupt yourself before somebody, disrupts you? And so it was being close and connected to a startup community, and putting direct skin in the game. I'd argue Airbus's model, at least at the time, was a bit more independence, still kind of benefiting from the parent co. But I knew personally that the culture inside of Boeing at that time, when it was taking its first step in this space, wanted to have more control, wanted to feel like it had its arms around the entity and not just keep it as sort of an independent unit. So that was the basis for the design, right? It was keeping it on the balance sheet of Boeing. Inside we were all Boeing employees, so it just felt like part of the family. We were trying to change the culture in Boeing that was heavily not invented here kind of mindset, right? So the more that I could talk to engineering communities as a Boeing employee, not a, Boeing Ventures, independent, employee, like I was one of them. It was such a cultural transformation exercise in the early days that's just what we had to do. And so it took years to get the buy-in to the level it's at sort of today, and to have the relationships that we have today, which is why it also made it the perfect time then to do the spin out, where you could kind of benefit from a bit more independence and that third-party capital. But I don't think we would have been successful if we would have tried to do that from day one inside of Boeing. It would have been impossible to build the relationships as strongly as we have today. And, it would have just been a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our people would have argued, see, we're not getting value out of the ventures program because they weren't embracing it. Well, we wouldn't be able to deliver value from the ventures program because Boeing wasn't embracing it. And it would have, unfortunately, probably shut down. So we had to sequence it, the right way, which thankfully I think we did.
I really like the journey you are describing and you took. Building buy-in is really critical. And can you walk us through how you build buy-in? And especially you talked about delivering strategic value. How did you define it? And I'm sure it's not from your perspective, but actually from Boeing's perspective. So how did you articulate it?
Yeah, and it's complicated. So the buy-in comes in many ways. I mentioned the antibodies that come out at the beginning, right? Something that looks different, something that looks threatening potentially to, R&D and the Boeing way of doing things. It's hard to sometimes appreciate 105 years of company history, has so much passed down knowledge in addition to the knowledge of the folks that are there today of, the Boeing way of doing things that, you really are acting as a change agent, from day one. I will admit we got some things wrong very early in the Boeing HorizonX Ventures days, simply because we thought our purpose was so strong that it was going to be obvious to everyone, right? And so we just started executing and thought others would jump on the train with us as we went, that it would just be, so clear that this is capturing value that people would be dying to help us. Well, in fact, the opposite was true. They saw us moving forward and they hunkered down even more, or became, even more sort of passive to, embracing this sort of capability. And we had the support of the CEO, we had the support of the CFO. So you still think, hey, I have that top-down champion, so it'll just work itself out. Well, big companies, it doesn't work that way. You have middle layers, and you have obstacles that you don't even know are there, but they're quietly working in the background to maybe not actively make things complicated, but they're certainly not making things easier. And so we pivoted quickly when we saw this coming up to a much more engaged effort across the organization. I built up a team around portfolio development. We now call it applied innovation inside of Boeing, and they're sitting in the technical community, and they reside and report into the chief technology officer, and that can bring some, I guess, respect and assurances that we have the best interest of the chief technology office at heart, and we're there to build relationships. It's a communications journey, right? If people are left to interpret the purpose of the venture unit on their own, they're going to naturally, most people go to their skepticism or dark place, as I call it, right? Versus a much more active and embracive approach to roadshow the venture platform around the organization, to communicate not only the relationship and partnership we want to have with the technical community, but also the benefits that can come. And then once you start showing some of that success, when you have a couple of near wins of how we've embraced a new capability and it's turned into cost savings or new revenue or new capability for Boeing, then you just use those examples to showcase others, and it's contagious at that point. It's like, oh wow, yeah, they were able to do it there, and boy, that didn't hurt anybody, or that wasn't threatening to them. They actually had a better outcome. They performed better. Like, wow, this is great. And then other areas jump along. But I boil it down to just one simple premise: over communicate. Nicolas, is what I'd recommend, right? The more you showcase and communicate with your partners around your corporate teams, the better off it'll be. Don't let people interpret things in isolation and potentially stay passive, or at worst case become obstructionists.
I really like it. I think over communicate, I think is such a good golden nugget. But what's interesting, and maybe I will push back a little bit, is over communicating at the very early stage where you have nearly no portfolio companies. Once we have portfolio companies, and then once you start to be having early successes, which you can communicate about. So I want to dissect the three stages, because when you talked about this applied innovation to CTO, if you had started with no portfolio companies, that team would have nothing to do. So can you walk through the over communicate for the first stage where you just started?
Yep.
Then once you start to have a portfolio company that's big enough to actually engage more deeply, and then once you have already early successes, can you walk through this step 1, step 2, step 3?
Sure. So step 1 really is just getting the buy-in to the purpose, right? And communicating why we're doing this. We're not doing venture capital to fire more engineers inside of Boeing, right? Which is something they can be concerned with. I'm not doing venture capital to steal R&D fundings from engineers. And so it's really just sort of communicating some of those basic principles. And you're not talking to them, you're having conversations and open dialogue. You're listening, you're hearing their questions and concerns, and you're communicating how this all fits together, right? It's just sort of the 30,000 foot level, like how this is going to work. And then what you do is you also, I would say, show the engineering community that you're serious about this, of pulling them in to the overall sort of process, right? And that could be just early examples of some deal screening, right? Maybe some companies that you've been exposed to and you want to take it to a further level of assessment. Pull some of those engineers into the mix. Hey, what do you think of this technology? You don't have to, this is going to sound bad, you don't listen to them 100%. You don't have to take everything, the feedback that you get is 100% gospel. Like if one engineer doesn't like something, you throw away a deal. Like you have the right to pressure test, you have the right to push back and have open dialogue, but you're still acknowledging to them that you respect their input and you want them to be part of the journey. And that goes a long way. So that's the communication at that stage. Then when you have sort of a deal scoped, you feel like an investment is on the horizon, really where we get a lot of success is then bringing a group of stakeholders into the mix to really flush out, okay, now to a real tangible level, how are we going to work together? What is going to be that initial proof of concept? What is going to be some tech exchange or joint IP development or any kind of program that might play itself out? We have a lot of members on our team that can think about that independently, and we could make some suggestions, right? But again, it's bringing those engineering teams and others along with the journey so they feel like they're part of the creation, as opposed to something that just was thrown over the fence to them and now they're just sort of reacting out of the blue, and it's like, oh, I wish I was part of this. And so that's what I mean by the middle stage. And then the last stage, then this is when you have an active proof of concept going, or active results are being achieved from the integration of portfolio company capability and Boeing capability. And that's where you have to be shouting from the rooftops and communicating across the organization of why the venture model is working, how it's delivering outcomes to Boeing. And this is where you get others involved, not just the technical communities, because they've been with you on the journey all along, but the business development communities, the program management communities, the P&Ls of your organization, that this is actually, maybe it's not moving the needle in like big company sense of like delivering billions of dollars of orders, but it's moving the needle on innovation and new opportunities for Boeing and the startups in the long run. And so that's how I think about it in your three phase kind of approach.
Very nice. And then I want to triple click on this applied innovation reporting to the CTO, because that's clearly an innovative setup where you're building a team that actually doesn't report to the venture team.
Yes.
By the way, where did you report in terms of Boeing Ventures?
When I was still inside of Boeing, we reported to the chief strategy officer.
Okay.
And the chief strategy officer is a direct report to the CEO. So it was aligned that way. We had a couple different frameworks along our 5-year journey. At one point, before there was a chief strategy officer, we dual reported to the chief financial officer and the chief technology officer. So and the CFO also had corporate development and everything else under him. So we've evolved, right? It sort of was bifurcated, and now everything's aligned under chief strategy officer. But that was even more reason to set up something that resided inside the technical community, and hence the applied innovation sort of stand up. And I'll pause there if you had a direct question about that.
Yeah, exactly. Because first, the fact you reported to the CSO is clearly a very strong signal. You're looking at long-term strategy and you're going to make investments along that. What I like about this team that reports to the CTO is that you're showing these direct connections between your investment and building the roadmap.
Yes.
But you don't control that team anymore if it doesn't report to you.
Correct.
So how do you ensure that this actually works as you intended versus Especially when you mention antibodies. Here, you're
Yeah.
basically killing the antibodies, but how?
So again, this all sort of came to the timing of when we did everything. The fact that we had 5 years of history inside the company, so I didn't have to do the explanation of why we're doing this anymore. People understand why we were doing venture. So I wasn't fighting those antibodies, but really how applied innovation stays successful in the CTO's office is, one is a fundamental, just we have an aligned interest here, right? Boeing, we haven't talked specifics, but Boeing is still the largest limited partner in my current fund, and it will be a major limited partner in future funds. So it has a direct, benefit to the success we're able to deliver from an applied innovation front. So if that applied innovation team does more adoption, does more insertion of this capability to market channels, which makes the startups even more successful, that's going to spring around to Boeing being such a exposed LP in our fund, and it'll get sort of better returns. So it gets the double whammy. It gets the value from embracing the tech and selling it in its channels, and then also the return from the fund. So that at its core is enough to say, gosh, applied innovation is an entity worth resourcing, and we're going to keep the team in place. Because otherwise the model dissolves a little bit, or it's not as effective as it could be. And so, given that you're really just justifying some headcount and some R&D dollars to work some proof of concepts together, I think it's a good business case and good return. But to talk about applied innovation a little bit more about really what's unique about it, it's more than just sort of our passive interface. We have so much exchange, and it's a bidirectional exchange of information and capability, that's really what makes it unique. So applied innovation has an entity called emerging capabilities, and what they're trying to do is really aggregate the needs and wants of Boeing, whether explicitly provided by the technical teams, or sort of implied based on this team's own independent assessment of where Boeing's weaknesses might be, where the opportunities could be in the future for disruptive technology, and critically, like, where are the gaps along the way that we have to fill and find in the outside world, because it's just better than trying to create it yourself. And so that team is a key interface with us to help inform where might exciting, deal flow and opportunities be to disrupt aerospace. And so we're doing our own scanning on the outside, but it's nice to have this sort of whisper in your ear of like, wow, there are some really exciting opportunities for growth if we find a startup that can do X, and then we can go on the hunt for that. And then you have the wraparound, a portfolio development team that once we find X, or we find anything else that we invest in, you have that concierge service inside of Boeing that can pull it inside and bring direct capability to the startups that only can come from a large manufacturer like Boeing. So they need support from a government regulatory professional. The applied innovation team will connect them to that. So that's how we've operationalized it, and so far it's working quite well.
So many golden nuggets. But one thing I'm starting to realize, and I think we're going to move towards the hybrid discussion now, is that this applied innovation team is one of the secret weapons, in a way, of what made this transition to hybrid work so well.
Yes.
Because you can rely on a team that has operationalized best practices to bring this value creation. You said earlier, investment is a means to value creation. How do you make sure this transition doesn't destroy that value creation, but actually you're keeping that team intact, right? Yes. So can you share how much of your moving to an hybrid model would be or would not be possible if you didn't have this applied innovation team already in place with a very clean reporting line and very clear deliverables?
Yeah. It's no doubt it's the secret weapon. And in fact, I use that exact phrase, when I talk about it, whether it's folks inside of Boeing or when we're talking to startups and trying to advocate, for our involvement or showcasing why HorizonX should be an investor in a particular company. It really is something different in and of itself. That said, I won't say it's impossible to be successful in this hybrid model without it. It certainly doesn't have to be resourced as large as maybe our applied innovation team has stood up. But I think fundamentally, though, you need to have alignment on the principles of what you need to keep that value creation story going. We toyed with the idea of just keeping a team inside the chief strategy officer and building it out that way. And maybe that would work in your particular companies. But, for us, again, back to the engineering dominated sort of culture, the CTO office was the ultimate, place for us. I just think at the end of the day, the best deals out there are becoming more and more competitive, right? There's capital everywhere that good startups are getting exposed to. If you want to make the case for why, a startup should be looking at you as an investor, why they should focus their time and attention to working commercial deals with you and not somebody else on their screen, on their cap table, like these sort of things, I think, make a difference. We're putting real money where our mouth is, but via the investment, but we're also bringing a dedicated team. And this is what they do 100% of their time. This isn't like a 5% portion of their day and really they're doing internal innovation the other 95% of the time. This is robustly compartmentalized for this sort of activity to be the key interface to us and the key interface to the portfolio companies for Boeing. And so I'm a huge believer in it. If you can get your companies to your corporate parents to resource it and do the hybrid model, because that's the trade at the end of the day, right? If we previously had been investing hundreds of millions of dollars off Boeing's balance sheet just to do the equity investments, and now they're saving that money, they don't have to resource as much, and instead they can focus a little more in securing nominal R&D dollars to keep an applied innovation capability up and running. I'd argue that's a win for them, any day of the week, because they're still going to get, benefits from being LPs in your fund and get good returns on a portion of their investment. And they're going to get all of the value that comes from having applied innovation really ensure that technology is successful inside the four walls of the Boeing company.
Very nice. And in a way, they are the perfect value add LP for you because it brings this team, and you even mentioned the concierge service. So it's not like a generic response to every startup's. Concierge service means you're really looking at each startup with their own needs.
Absolutely. Think about that real quick, that point from, if you're another LP looking at it, where you want to deploy your money and which funds to invest to, there's now a bunch of funds out there that are looking at mobility, that are looking at sustainability. Do you want to invest in a fund that, maybe is just a diverse mix of LPs, but really just money at the end of the day? Or might you want to invest your money into something that has that secret weapon, again, that is bringing value to the startups, every single day? And the best part with this new structure, all the worries of the past, let me step back. When you're inside a corporate parent, I'm sure others have felt this, where other investors that might join a particular startup with you might have a worry of, hey, what's Boeing's perverse incentive for investing in this company? Are they just going to steal the IP or are they going to hold it hostage or whatever? Like, hey, they're controlling the investment, so there might be some conflicts of interest, right? Now we have that level of independence. We are a fund manager. We have a fiduciary obligation to all of our LPs. We can't do something that is at the worst interests of our other LPs just to favor Boeing. That would be improper. And so all these other LPs can see that. while at the same time, we have this exclusive strategic relationship with Boeing to pull on the capabilities where needed. So we can sort of feather that just the right amount that ensures no sort of negative conflicts that would jeopardize another LP's interest, but at the whole level, I would argue inflates the value for everyone that's involved in the fund.
It's very nice. And so you have this amazing LP who knows you well, you know them well, they add value. How do you frame your decision of which LPs you're bringing along? And are you expecting them to also add value, or are you looking at some which will just be financial? And when I say just financial, I don't mean the capital, but also helping for the next round of financing.
Yep.
So how do you choose your next LPs? And then I have David Juarez, who is also asking if you can disclose a few of these LPs. So you don't have to, but if you feel like you could, as the argumentation of the value add, that would be great.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't disclose specific names, but what I can disclose is more to your first question of how do we think about the LP universe that joins us. And I definitely think about it in a diverse makeup of LPs. I kind of think of it as a hub and spoke model of, hey, we're in the middle and there's unique sort of criteria or capability that you can think about for everybody that encircles the fund and wants to participate. Some, yes, I absolutely expect many to be just direct sort of financial investors. They have to allocate billions of dollars of capital a year across funds around the world. They have to put money to work, and they just want to invest money and get a return, right? It's nothing more complicated. Keep them informed with quarterly reporting of how you're doing from fund performance, what the portfolio health is, but that's it. No more complicated than that. Then there's others that I call are sort of quasi-strategic, right? Either they're affiliated with some sort of government entity around the world, or they're finance the dollars that can open doors to other things, where you might want a more direct conversation and linkage with the funds because they can either help you with business adoption of portfolio company capability in their respective geography. They might have unique customers that they can introduce you to for your portfolio to help grow revenue. And you just sort of tailor those sort of unique on a case-by-case basis to ensure you're getting everything you can out of that LP, and that they also feel like they're getting a win, for deploying their money with you. And then lastly is the true strategic, right? No, I wouldn't ever have Lockheed Martin, Airbus, or something as an LP that conflicts with a Boeing fund. I don't think that's in the best, sort of interests of anybody, because it becomes too complicated. It's not that I don't think we could actually work something very strategic together, but I don't think we have to do it at the fund level. I would rather co-invest with an Airbus, with a Lockheed Martin on a deal by deal basis and work that all out instead of complicate it at the fund level. And we will co-invest with those companies. I mean, it makes all the sense in the world. But there's other strategics, whether it's companies that are further down in the supply chain or bring some other sort of capability to aerospace at large, or other, maybe it's actually an automotive strategic, and they can bring a complementary set of industry capabilities to the aerospace angle of Boeing, and together we elevate these startups with new experience and access to value inside these corporates. And so yes, all those three are really how I think about my LP makeup.
And in your strategy, what would be the ideal makeup? Is it like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or mostly strategic? Or because you're clearly looking at diversity of LPs, and I see the value of that, but you probably also think about what you want to bring to the entrepreneurs.
Yeah,
and that's really I'm guessing that's where you're coming from.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this before, right? How do you think about your entrepreneurs as your customers, right? At the end of the day, you want to do everything we can to support those entrepreneurs. But I also appreciate the realities of executing complicated structures with too many strategics and, just managing all of that. So, walk before we run. We've just launched a pretty transformative hybrid model, at least for Boeing's point of view. And so, I certainly want to make sure we're delivering to expectations there. So I would say this probably evolves with each new fund that we raise. And I think getting to a third is, as I think about it, probably a nice sort of balance to all of the interests involved. In the earlier days, maybe it's going to take a stronger weighting of those, type 1, type 2, i.e. more financial, more semi-strategic, just to ensure we have the capital to support and that we can manage the interfacing of how we bring all this strategic value to bear. I don't want to have all this strategic value sitting on the sideline that I can't do anything with because we just haven't figured out all the nuances of operationalizing it. So yeah, I think it evolves with time.
Very nice. Now, for anyone who is listening and that is like, wow, I want to try the hybrid model, do you have a word of caution for them?
Absolutely, right. There's, you cannot at all make the interest in pursuing the hybrid model come across as self-serving, right? If I would have stepped back and one of my first conversations at Boeing, if I would have phrased it as, look, I want to spin out the venture fund because frankly, you're not paying me enough, and I need to get on the outside because that'll give me more independence from you, and I'll get paid more, right? That is going to be a losing battle, right? That is not how you get a company to untether you. It has to start with the value proposition and why it's in the best interest of Boeing, and I believe it, right? Are some of those other things true in the sense that it kind of comes along with it? Yes, it's good for all to have a little more independence for speed, and yes, it's better for team composition and long-term retention to be able to pay them more market standards for venture. Yes, but that is not the primary reason for doing it. The primary reason for doing it is to expose yourself to broader sources of capital so you can make bigger investments in the startups, you can make more investments in startups, and you can support your corporate parent by giving them the ability to roll some of the investment they might have otherwise made in just equity to instead operationalizing capability, so it jumpstarts and accelerates sort of that advancement in your respective industries and your respective companies. And so that to me was the primary thesis, and I would just avoid that other scenario I talked about of how you try to socialize it.
Very nice and very candid. Thank you. And so you convinced Boeing, they agree with the structure. Now you need to raise money from other LPs, and I'm sure you had early discussions to get some feedback that this was the right way. How did you raise that money? How did you, is it like a sales process where you lock a marquee customer, which is like a marquee LP, even though it's not the anchor LP, and then you roll to more? Or did you try to do the shotgun and you talk to 20 of them and then you hope that 5 says yes?
Yeah, I started with more of the first, like who's your marquee going to be? In this case, I'd argue it's very, very simple. Your corporate parent should be the marquee, right? If they believe in this so much, right, and it's not just viewed as some sort of divestiture or something that they're getting away from, but instead they believe in this so much that they're going to invest new capital to kind of recapitalize this fund as it spins out. So, if you're this other LP sitting on the sideline, you see this like, wait a second, they're actually relinquishing control of something that they bear hug, and they're putting more money in. Wow, they must really believe in how this model is going to work, how they're going to ensure it's successful. Boy, me as this other LP sitting on the sideline, I want to get in on that. And so that was, I think, a key piece of just the upfront. Okay, Boeing, what are you willing to commit to, so I can start showcasing that to other potential LPs? And it didn't have to go far. I didn't want to make this first fund, a $500 million fund. I actually wanted this first fund to be recapitalized just enough to do what I thought was going to be appropriate to have the follow-on investment dollars needed for our current portfolio, and then keep a kitty of new investment capital going, that I could keep making some new investments while we're simultaneously setting up for a fund 2 structure that's really going to be a from scratch. Again, Boeing is a marquee LP in that fund, but really from scratch, being resourced from the outside. So no carryover portfolio companies from the legacy HorizonX Boeing days, a fresh new fund that's going to leverage this model that we stood up. So I didn't have to go far. I did some direct reach out, scattershot approach to a couple LPs, some that had reached out to me and expressed interest in the past, and it was able to close pretty quickly.
Very nice. I think you're sharing quite a few good tips on how to do it. Maybe the one thing that's interesting for us to understand is, when you went to these other potential LPs, did you bring along your CSO or other people from Boeing to show their full commitment to the process, or you didn't need to and it was really you raising the fund?
I didn't need to, but I had the discretion to pull that cord if I needed to, right? So again, having the buy-in from your chief advocate inside your corporate parent, in my case, the chief strategy officer, that's always great to know that you can call on it. But we had developed a fund deck that outlined the portfolio, the successes to date, the new structure, and it was more just one-on-one engagement with these LPs to talk to them about the opportunity, and that was enough.
Very nice. And for LPs who are considering your fund 2, so maybe those who are listening in, you're still investing from your fund 1, which you have recapitalized and cleaned up and everything.
Yes.
How should they think about when you're going to invest from fund 2 versus still a few investments from fund 1?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, you have some overlap, right? You are winding down your investment activity, but still in a very heavily focused maintenance mode and company by company engagement. Yeah, while at the same time you ensure you are now scouting and investing in those new deals and getting back to sort of the early stage investment of new companies that really made you successful in the first place. So to me, there's nice overlap, and that's going to be what happens in 2022. You're gonna have this sort of wind down, maintenance period of fund 1, and then you're going to have the accelerated sort of growth of fund 2, where you're not only raising the capital, but you're deploying it at that next tranche of early stage companies.
Very nice. And of course, with a fund 2 structure, the way you describe it, that gives you options to recruit different profiles than you could do before. Now, having the option doesn't mean that you should take advantage of it. You may want to continue recruiting the same profiles you had before. So how are you thinking about what type of profiles and talents you want to recruit for your fund 2?
Yeah. I'd say, if anything, the thing that changes is really thinking now, what do we do with access to more capital? When you're inside the corporate, yes, you might have some earmarked, annual dollars. This is how much I want you to invest and everything. But you also kind of think things along the lines of like, what's the minimal amount I can invest in this, given that it's Boeing's balance sheet? I'd argue now we're going to have access to more capital than we ever did at Boeing. And so I want to start thinking about, from a profile perspective, like, when do we go bigger earlier? When do we think about larger ownerships on the cap table? When you're in a corporate, I'm sure it's similar for others. There's sort of that golden rule, hey, let's not go over 20% ownership, because then you can consolidate financial statements and it becomes messy. Well, that's different when you're a fund manager, right? You can take more than 20% ownership if it makes sense for that investment. And then the other part, which we really haven't talked much on this session, Nicolas, is the connection we have from the Aero Equity and the AE Industrial side of the house, which is the legacy private equity side. We get extended resources and value from them as well, right? Gosh, they have $3 billion of assets under management of aerospace grade portfolio companies. They're also deploying money to acquire companies, to invest in companies that are at growth and sort of buyout level stages. And so how do we think about that from a long-term integrated strategy of, hey, we can invest in companies at the early tech stages out of the venture fund, and then when they transition to growth or even eventual buyout, we have the private equity side that can help with even bigger checks. We can help with SPACs, we can help with IPOs, we can help with private buyout. And so that's really the part that as we get to fund two, we're really going to be able to think more about the architecture of our long-term investment strategy in each of these companies.
I can't stop thinking that for any entrepreneurs who are watching this video, you are becoming such a more compelling place for them to get investment from. Before you had clearly Boeing and all the value creation. You keep talking about bidirectional, which I really like this term. But right now you're starting to think even more like a financial VC. You start to have even more capabilities than you could before, more options than you could before. And if you choose well your LPs, you could actually even have more tool set that you can bring to them.
Exactly.
It sounds too good to be true. So is there anything you're giving up in this hybrid model?
Oh boy. I'd say the jury's still out on that. It's early days, right? We haven't closed a fund two, it's not like any of that's closed. So I'm going to consolidate, feedback and discussion as I talk to a lot of LPs next year around fund two. If anything, it's just how all this fits with inside a registered investor sort of framework too, that AE Industrial is, right? This isn't just, this is still a regulated industry. We have to be very ethical. We have to be very appropriate with how, we do things. And that's great. And so it's, I think it's just give us more time, and I'll come back to you in our next chat with more thoughts of what I felt we've given up. But right now, I've said this to a lot of people. It feels like we truly are having our cake and eating it too. We have set up a model where you get the best of both worlds. You get the benefits of why you built CVC in the first place and why corporate parents are uniquely positioned to really drive venture activity in the future, but we're able to do it with all the benefits of being more of a dedicated fund structure, what that means for your team, what that means for compensation, what that means for deal flow and sourcing and scanning, right? Sometimes companies don't want to come to the Boeings of the world because they're afraid of what a Boeing might do. We get access to all sorts of new deal flow that we didn't have just while we were inside of Boeing proper. So I think so far it's knock on wood, it's all playing out like a lot of upside and so far minimal, if any, downside.
Very nice. So maybe we are getting to the top of the hour. My last question for you, and this is really for potential co-investors, but also entrepreneurs who are listening in. What are you excited to invest next? What are the themes or investment theses that you want to share so that people know how to reach out for the right opportunities?
Yeah, well, we're I call it almost artificially broad in how we think about our themes and focus areas. So there's a lot that I'm excited by, and some would call it, just you're jumping all over the place, but
it's okay. You can give Brian's wish list.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Nicolas, we obviously wouldn't be successful if we weren't trying to address the aerospace needs of the future and how we fundamentally can transform the future of transportation. And that doesn't just mean, hey, what might go on an airplane? There's so much more to that. And it's software, it's hardware, it's cybersecurity, it's infrastructure. And I just fundamentally believe the world that we're living in now is going to look so different from a transportation system in the next 10 to 20 years. You're going to have new levels of electric propulsion and mobility. Think of what Tesla is doing for the ground. You're going to have a similar transformation in aerospace. You're going to have, new modalities of how you get from A to B, not just hub and spoke networks, but other ways of urban mobility and other forms of transportation. I'm really excited by the sustainability journey that aerospace is now finally grabbing onto. It had been resistant to change in that world, or frankly, even a bit just dismissive of what it was contributing to overall kind of carbon output and maybe putting in the too hard category. It's like, that's too hard to replace jet fuel with something else. But we're seeing that groundswell of change happening, not only at the big companies like Boeing, but even at the innovation levels of, hey, how can we make the world better with electrification or with hydrogen or with new sustainable aviation fuels or taking out carbon from the atmosphere. So I'm really excited by that world. So I know that's a lot, but if you're dealing with hardware, software, sustainability, space, connectivity, industrial manufacturing and automation, I want to hear from you because I think there's exciting things we can do together.
Very nice. And you can count TDK Ventures as interested on the cross of mobility and sustainability. Brian, thank you so much. You were super candid and sharing so many details. I think it was super, super good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicolas. Great being here, and take care, everyone.
Thank you, Brian. Bye.